The first detail didn't stand out because of how much there was. It stood out because of how little. A Tucson Police Department crime scene technician paused just inside the entryway, her attention fixed on a section of tile no larger than a sheet of paper. The house was quiet in a way that felt preserved. Furniture undisturbed, surfaces clean, nothing overturned or broken. If you stepped back and looked at the room as a whole, there was nothing that immediately suggested violence had taken place there. But that small section of floor told a different story. The blood was concentrated, not scattered. It hadn't sprayed across the walls or carried outward into the rest of the home. There were no signs of prolonged movement, no dragged patterns, no overlapping impressions, and no indication that someone had been moved through the space after the injury occurred. It was contained, localized. And that distinction mattered, because in a controlled abduction, especially one involving a high-value ransom, time, movement, and silence are everything. The goal is speed without resistance. Entry, control, exit. Minimal disruption, minimal trace. This didn't look like that. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact. From the outside, the property appeared secured. Even inside, nothing about the home suggested panic or disorder. There were no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no evidence of a search. Only that one interruption near the entrance, a single point where something went wrong. Investigators would later reconstruct the early hours of February 1st, 2026, through fragments, digital signals, timestamps, system logs. But standing in that entryway before any of those timelines had been fully assembled, the scene already presented a quiet contradiction. If this had been a planned kidnapping, it had not unfolded cleanly. And if it hadn't unfolded cleanly, then everything that followed, the messages, the demands, the narrative presented to the public, would need to be examined against that single contained moment on the floor. Because whatever happened in that space didn't suggest control. It suggested interruption. Something brief, close, uncontained in intention, even if contained in evidence. At that point, the country didn't know any of this. What the public would soon see instead was a very different version of events, one that spoke in precise numbers, structured language, and calculated demands. A version that described a victim still alive, still being held, still part of a transaction that could, in theory, be completed. But inside that house, before the story left the property, there was already a problem. The evidence didn't match the narrative, and in cases like this, that gap doesn't stay hidden for long. By the time investigators began reconstructing the timeline, they understood something important about Nancy Guthrie before they understood what happened to her. She was consistent. At 84 years old, Nancy had built her life around routine, not out of limitation, but out of preference. Her days followed a structure that rarely shifted. She woke early, kept her home in order, and stayed closely connected to a small but steady circle of friends and family. She drove herself when she needed to. She handled her own errands. Independence for her wasn't symbolic, it was practical. That consistency would later become one of the most valuable reference points in the case. Because when something disrupted it, the deviation stood out immediately. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, nothing about her schedule suggested anything unusual. She had gone out for dinner, something she did occasionally, usually choosing familiar places where the staff recognized her. There were no reports of tension, no signs of distress, no indication that she believed she was being followed or watched. By all available accounts, it was an ordinary night. At approximately 9:50 p.m., Nancy returned home. Her garage door opened, then closed behind her, a detail confirmed later through system logs tied to the property. It was the last moment. That could be described as routine. After that, the house went quiet. For investigators, that quiet wasn't empty. It was structured, measurable. Her home, like many modern residences, was connected. Subtle layers of technology tracking movement, access points, and activity in the background. Not intrusive, but present enough to create a digital outline of events when something went wrong. And something did. But before that disruption could be understood, there was another factor investigators had to account for. One that didn't appear in the ransom notes and wasn't referenced in any of the messages sent to the media. Nancy's health. She lived with a cardiac condition that required careful, consistent management. A pacemaker regulated her heart rhythm, synced to a mobile device that monitored activity and transmitted data. In addition to that, she relied on daily medication, timed doses that weren't optional but necessary to maintain stability. From a medical standpoint, interruption wasn't just a concern, it was a risk. Experts would later explain that missing even a single cycle of that medication could begin to affect her condition within hours. Not immediately catastrophic, but progressive. The longer the gap, the greater the danger. And that detail mattered, because in cases involving ransom, especially those designed to extract payment, the condition of the victim is typically central to the communication strategy. Proof of life, reassurance, leverage built around urgency. None of that appeared here. At this stage, though, no one outside the investigation was focusing on that absence. If public attention hadn't reached the level of detail where medical dependency would be questioned. The narrative was still forming, still being shaped by what would soon be presented. But inside the investigative process, those details were already being logged. Routine, timeline, health, environment. Each one forming a baseline. Because when something disrupts a system that's stable, the question isn't just what happened. It's how quickly everything changed. Think about this for a moment. When someone lives a life this structured, even small changes become visible. For several hours after Nancy Guthrie returned home, nothing appeared to happen. No alarms, no calls, no visible disturbance. From the outside, the property remained still. Lights off, doors closed, the kind of quiet that blends into every other house on the street. But inside that silence, a sequence of events began to take shape. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in fragments. Each one recorded, time-stamped, and stored. The first disruption came at 1:47 a.m. Nancy's doorbell camera, mounted near the front entrance, went offline. Not due to a system error, not from a loss of power. Investigators would later determine that the device had been physically interfered with. The signal didn't drop gradually, it stopped. Abruptly. That detail alone raised questions. In planned intrusions, disabling surveillance is often one of the first steps. It suggests awareness. Someone knew the camera was there, knew its function, and made a deliberate effort to neutralize it before approaching the entry point. But what followed didn't fully align with that level of control. At 2:12 a.m., a motion was detected on the property. The system didn't capture clear footage. The camera was already offline. But the sensor still registered activity. Movement within range. Long enough to trigger the alert. 25 minutes had passed since the camera was disabled, which meant whatever happened in that gap wasn't instantaneous. There was time between entry and detection, time that investigators would later try to account for. Then, at 2:28 a.m., a third and far more critical signal was lost. Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting. Under normal conditions, the device maintained a steady connection with her phone, logging data and syncing regularly. When that connection dropped, it wasn't subtle. It registered as a clear interruption in the system, and unlike the doorbell camera, this wasn't something that could be disabled from outside the body. When the pacemaker went dark, it meant one of two things. The device had malfunctioned, or Nancy was no longer in a condition where it could transmit. From the first disruption at 1:47 a.m. to the loss of signal at 2:28 a.m., the entire sequence lasted 41 minutes. 41 minutes in which a routine night shifted into something investigators would later describe as irreversible. What happened inside that window became the central focus of the case. Because when timelines are this tight, every minute carries weight. If the intent had been a controlled abduction, those 41 minutes should have reflected coordination, entry, control, removal, clean, efficient, purposeful. Instead, the sequence suggested hesitation, or complication. The delay between disabling the camera and triggering motion raised one possibility. Whoever entered the property did not move immediately. There may have been time spent inside before approaching the door, or time spent waiting, but the presence of blood near the entrance would later shift that interpretation. Because if the critical moment occurred at the doorway, then the timeline didn't represent a clean progression. It represented escalation. Something that didn't go according to plan, or wasn't planned in the way it was later presented. By the time the pacemaker signal was lost, whatever had happened was already complete. Not in the sense of resolution, but in the sense that the defining moment had passed. After 2:28 a.m., there were no additional signals tied directly to Nancy's movement. No outgoing communication. No activity suggesting a relocation or transport. Just absence. And yet, in the days that followed, a different version of those 41 minutes would be introduced to the public. A version that extended the timeline beyond what the evidence appeared to support. A version that suggested Nancy was still alive, still being held, still part of an ongoing negotiation. But within the structure of that night, the data didn't show continuation. It showed interruption. And in investigations like this, the difference between those two is everything. The first message didn't go to Nancy Guthrie's family. It went to the media. 3 days after her disappearance, major news organizations across the United States began receiving nearly identical communications. The delivery method varied, some through encrypted email, and others through anonymous submission channels. But the content remained consistent. Structured, precise, controlled. The message identified Nancy by name. It stated that she had been taken, and it set a demand. $6 million payable in Bitcoin. There was a deadline, and there were instructions. From the outside, it resembled a calculated ransom operation, one designed not just to reach the family, but to establish immediate national visibility. By sending the message to media outlets instead of private contacts, whoever was responsible ensured that the story would spread quickly, amplifying pressure and urgency. Within hours, it did. News coverage expanded across networks. Nancy's image circulated widely. Analysts, former investigators, and commentators began weighing in, discussing possibilities, assessing the credibility of the demand, and comparing the case to previous kidnappings involving digital ransom requests. Law enforcement responded at scale. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined local authorities, establishing a coordinated command structure. Search teams were deployed across areas surrounding Tucson, including remote desert regions where visibility is limited and terrain can complicate recovery efforts. Air support was introduced. Data analysis units began working through digital evidence, communications, device logs, and location-based information. From a procedural standpoint, the response matched the narrative. A high-value kidnapping, a defined ransom, a victim believed to be alive. But within that narrative, certain elements stood out not because they were dramatic, but because they were unusual. The ransom notes were polished, not just in language, but in structure. The instructions were clear, formatted in a way that suggested preparation. The Bitcoin demand included specific guidance on how the transaction should be completed, including wallet details and verification expectations. This wasn't improvised. It read as something constructed in advance. More notably, the messages referenced details from inside Nancy's home, subtle points that had not been released publicly. Layout features, object placement, information that suggested familiarity with the interior environment. That detail carried weight because it implied access, not just to the property, but to knowledge of it. At that stage, however, those references were interpreted in a way that supported the kidnapping narrative, and if the individual responsible had been inside the home, it reinforced the idea of a targeted abduction. Someone who had planned entry, understood the environment, and executed the removal. But that interpretation depended on one assumption, that Nancy had been taken from that location alive. And that assumption had not yet been challenged publicly. The messages continued over the following days, reiterations of the demand, reinforcement of the deadline, consistent tone. There was no visible shift in language, no escalation, no signs of panic or urgency from the sender. Just repetition. $6 million. Bitcoin. Deadline. What didn't appear in those communications was equally important. There was no direct outreach to Nancy's family, no attempt to establish a private line of negotiation, no proof of life, no image, no recording, no detail that could confirm she was still alive after the night she disappeared. In most ransom cases, those elements are central. They maintain leverage. They create urgency. They keep the transaction active. Here, they were absent. At the time, that absence didn't immediately disrupt the public narrative. The scale of the response, the involvement of federal agencies, and the visibility of the case sustained the belief that Nancy was still out there, somewhere, waiting. Hope filled the gaps. But within the investigation, those gaps were being measured, because a ransom demand without communication is not a negotiation. It's a statement. And statements, unlike negotiations, don't require a response to continue. They only require belief. At this stage, the entire country was looking at this as a kidnapping. Yeah, but based on what you've heard so far, does sending ransom demands to the media instead of the family feel strategic or misleading? By the end of the first week, the search for Nancy Guthrie had expanded beyond a local investigation. It had become a coordinated federal operation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation established a command post in Tucson, working alongside local law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and digital analysis units. Resources were allocated quickly. Ground teams assigned to sweep areas surrounding Nancy's neighborhood, aerial units scanning wider terrain, analysts reviewing incoming tips from across the country. From a procedural standpoint, the response followed a familiar structure. When a victim is believed to be alive and a ransom demand has been issued, time becomes the central variable, and every hour carries potential consequence. The assumption guiding the operation was clear. Nancy could still be located, recovered, and returned. And so the search moved outward. Teams focused first on proximity, areas closest to her home, then expanded into less accessible terrain, desert stretches, unpaved roads, isolated properties, locations where someone might attempt to conceal movement or hold a victim without immediate detection. At the same time, another part of the investigation moved inward, back to the house. Because while search teams covered distance, forensic analysts focused on detail. The blood near the entrance, initially just one element among many, became a point of closer examination. Not because of its volume, but because of its pattern. In forensic analysis, how blood appears can be as important as how much is present. There is a difference between blood that is transferred, left behind through contact, and blood that results from impact, where force causes it to disperse outward. Each type carries information about movement, position, and sequence. In Nancy's home, the available evidence suggested limited distribution. No extended trail, no signs of continued motion through the house, no indication that an injured person had been moved across multiple surfaces. That absence narrowed possibilities. If a victim is injured during an abduction and then transported, traces often follow, subtle, sometimes incomplete, but present. Here, investigators were looking at a contained event, something that happened in one place, and did not continue in the way a removal scenario typically would. At the same time, analysts reviewing the ransom communications were reaching their own set of observations. In cases involving financial demands, especially those structured around cryptocurrency, patterns tend to emerge. Offenders usually maintain consistent contact, adjusting tone based on response. They provide proof of life to reinforce credibility. They create urgency that builds as deadlines approach. Because the goal is not just to make a demand, it's to ensure that demand is taken seriously enough to be fulfilled. In Nancy's case, the structure was present, but the behavior wasn't. The messages were consistent but static. The deadlines were clear but flexible in practice. When one passed, another followed, with no visible consequence for delay. There was no escalation, no shift in language, no attempt to adapt based on response. From a behavioral standpoint, that created a problem, because effective ransom strategies depend on interaction, and interaction was missing. By the second week, those two lines of analysis, physical evidence and communication behavior, began to move closer together. Quietly. Not as a public statement, but as an internal question. What if the ransom wasn't driving the crime? What if it was following it? That distinction changes the structure of an investigation. Because if the primary event was not an abduction, but something else, something that occurred quickly within that 41-minute window, then everything introduced afterward would need to be reevaluated. Not as evidence of what happened, but as an attempt to explain it. Publicly, the search continued with the same level of intensity. Press briefings remained measured, and careful not to undermine the possibility that Nancy could still be alive. Hope at that stage remained part of the process, but internally, investigators were beginning to balance that hope against something else. Evidence that wasn't aligning, and in cases like this, alignment matters more than volume. Because the more effort it takes to sustain a narrative, the more likely it is that the narrative isn't being supported by what actually happened. The first deadline passed without incident. There was no confirmation, no escalation, no consequence tied to the failure to meet the demand. Just silence. For a case built around urgency, that silence carried weight. In most ransom-driven crimes, deadlines are not symbolic. They are functional. They are designed to pressure decision-making, to force movement, to create a sense that inaction leads to loss. When a deadline expires, the response typically shifts. The tone changes. Communication becomes sharper, more direct, sometimes more aggressive. That didn't happen here. Instead, another message followed. Same structure, same demand. A new deadline. No reference to the previous one. No acknowledgement that it had passed. From a behavioral standpoint, that kind of repetition without adjustment is difficult to reconcile with a genuine negotiation strategy. Because negotiation depends on feedback, and there was none. At the same time, something else remained unchanged. There was still no direct contact with Nancy's family. The messages continued to move outward, toward media channels, toward public visibility. The people most directly connected to her remained outside the communication loop. That detail began to draw closer attention within the investigation. Because in legitimate ransom scenarios, the family is central, not just emotionally, but practically. They are the point of contact, the decision makers, the ones who control whether a demand can be met. Bypassing them removes the most direct path to resolution, which raises a question. If the goal wasn't to secure payment, then what was the purpose of the demand? As the days extended into weeks, the absence of proof of life became harder to ignore. No images, no recordings, no specific, verifiable detail that could confirm Nancy was alive after the night of February 1st. In cases involving elderly victims, especially those with known medical conditions, proof of life becomes even more critical. It reassures investigators that time still exists, that recovery is still possible. Here, that reassurance never came. And there was another layer to that absence, one tied directly to Nancy herself, her medical dependency. By this point, investigators had fully established that Nancy required consistent medication to maintain her condition. Without it, the risk wasn't theoretical. It was measurable, and it increased over time. Yet across every message sent, across every repeated demand, there was no mention of her health. No indication that she was receiving care. No attempt to use that vulnerability as leverage. From a victimology perspective, that omission stood out. Victimology examines not just who a victim is, but how their characteristics influence a crime. Age, routine, health. These factors often shape offender behavior, especially in crimes involving control or captivity. And if Nancy had truly been held, her condition would have been central to the narrative. It would have been referenced, emphasized, used to reinforce urgency. Instead, it was ignored, which suggested one of two possibilities. Either the person responsible didn't know about her condition, or they did, and it no longer mattered. At the same time, media coverage continued to expand. National networks revisited the case daily. Analysts debated the credibility of the ransom. Speculation grew, filling the space left by the absence of new information. The structure of the story, elderly woman taken, high-value demand, ongoing investigation, kept it in circulation. And that circulation had an effect. In large-scale cases, media attention can shape perception before evidence fully settles. It can reinforce certain interpretations to sustain belief in a particular version of events, even as underlying details begin to shift. Here, the visibility of the Ransom narrative helped maintain the idea that Nancy was still alive, still part of an unfolding negotiation. But inside the investigation, that idea was becoming harder to support, because every element that should have sustained it, communication, proof, adaptation, was missing. What remained was structure without function, a demand without interaction, a timeline that ended, followed by a narrative that continued. And as those two layers moved further apart, the central question began to change. Not publicly, not yet, but within the case itself. It was no longer just about locating Nancy. It was about understanding why the story of her disappearance was being told this way. The first ransom note didn't arrive in a way investigators expected. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't an email sent directly to the family. It wasn't even a message routed through an attorney or intermediary. It was sent to the media. A national newsroom received it just under 72 hours after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. The message was structured, deliberate, and written with a level of clarity that immediately distinguished it from typical ransom communications. It outlined a demand, $6 million payable in Bitcoin within a fixed deadline. But what stood out wasn't just the amount, it was the audience. In most confirmed kidnapping for ransom cases, communication is controlled and targeted. The objective is to establish leverage over a specific party, usually the family, while minimizing outside interference. Public exposure introduces unpredictability. It brings in additional law enforcement resources. It reduces the kidnapper's ability to control the narrative. This did the opposite. By sending the note to major media outlets, whoever wrote it ensured immediate national attention. Within hours, Nancy's disappearance transformed from a local investigation into a widely broadcast case. Her name appeared on television screens, online headlines, and social media feeds across the country. And with that visibility came pressure. Pressure on investigators to act quickly. Pressure on the family to respond. Pressure on the public to watch, speculate, and engage. From an investigative standpoint, this shift introduced a critical question. Was the communication designed to facilitate a ransom or to construct a story? And the note itself contained details that had not been released publicly. It referenced the layout of Nancy's home in specific terms, including the position of her front entryway and certain interior features. These were not general descriptions. They suggested familiarity, either through prior access, direct observation, or detailed knowledge shared by someone who had been inside. That detail changed the scope of the investigation, because now the possibility of an unknown external offender began to compete with another scenario, that the person behind the message had a connection to Nancy's environment. Still, investigators proceeded methodically. The cryptocurrency demand introduced another layer. Bitcoin transactions, while often described as anonymous, are in reality traceable through public ledgers. However, tracing them requires time, and cooperation from exchanges, and most importantly, an actual transaction to follow. In this case, there wasn't one. No payment was made. No wallet address was definitively confirmed through repeated communication. No step-by-step negotiation unfolded. Instead, the message stood alone. From an analytical standpoint, this was unusual. In genuine ransom cases, communication tends to evolve. There are follow-up instructions, proof-of-life requests, adjustments to demands. A dynamic exchange forms between the perpetrator and the recipient. That interaction is what creates leverage. Here, there was none. The deadline came and passed without escalation. No consequence was introduced. No additional message clarified the next step. Then, days later, another note surfaced, again through media channels. It repeated elements of the original demand, but added little in terms of actionable progression. The structure remained polished, the tone remained controlled, but the absence of direct engagement persisted. This pattern began to shift how investigators interpreted the communication, Because if the goal was to secure payment, the strategy was failing. But if the goal was to maintain attention, to sustain a specific narrative, it was working. This is where the concept of narrative construction in criminal behavior becomes relevant. In some investigations, offenders attempt to shape perception after the fact. They introduce information not to advance a crime, but to influence how it is understood. This can delay investigative focus, redirect resources, or create alternative explanations that compete with emerging evidence. It does not replace physical evidence, but it can complicate how that evidence is interpreted. In Nancy's case, the physical evidence at the home already suggested a violent event. Blood near the entrance, the abrupt loss of biometric data from her pacemaker, and the lack of signs indicating a controlled removal all pointed towards something that happened quickly and possibly without planning. The ransom notes, however, introduced a competing storyline: that Nancy had been taken, that she was being held, and that her return depended on compliance with a financial demand. Two narratives began to exist simultaneously, one grounded in physical evidence, one sustained through communication, and they did not fully align. Another detail added to the discrepancy: Nancy's medical condition. She relied on daily heart medication that was not found missing from the home. Medical experts consulted during the investigation indicated that interruption of that treatment could lead to serious complications within a short time frame. Yet the ransom notes made no mention of it. No assurance that she was receiving care, no demand tied to urgency based on her condition, no acknowledgement of a factor that would directly impact her survival. In legitimate ransom scenarios involving vulnerable individuals, such details often become central to communication. They are used to increase pressure to reinforce the need for immediate action. Here it was absent, which raised another question. Was the person writing these messages fully aware of Nancy's condition? Or were they focused on constructing a narrative that did not require that level of accuracy? As the investigation moved forward, analysts began to treat the ransom notes not just as demands, but as evidence. Evidence of language patterns, evidence of knowledge, evidence of intent, not necessarily to collect money, but to shape perception. And slowly, the focus of the case began to shift again, because the longer the communication continued without producing results, the harder it became to reconcile it with a functioning ransom strategy. At some point, the question was no longer whether the notes were real. It was what role they were playing, and whether they were ever meant to lead to Nancy's return, or simply to delay the understanding of what had already happened. The investigation didn't just focus on what was visible, it expanded into what couldn't be seen, at least not without reconstruction. Because while the physical scene at Nancy Guthrie's home raised urgent questions, the ransom notes introduced something equally critical: a digital trail. Even when an offender attempts to remain anonymous, communication leaves behind patterns: technical, linguistic, and behavioral. And those patterns can be analyzed. The first step was tracing the origin of the messages sent to media outlets. Law enforcement, including federal cyber units, began working to identify how the communications were delivered. This process typically involves examining email headers, server routing paths, IP addresses, and any intermediary services used to mask identity. In many cases, offenders rely on anonymization tools, public Wi-Fi networks, VPNs, or temporary email services to obscure their location. These methods can slow down attribution, but they rarely eliminate all traces. What they do create, however, is a behavioral profile, because every choice, where to connect, when to send, how to structure a message, reflects decision-making, and decision-making can be studied. This is where digital forensics and behavioral analysis intersect. Investigators began mapping the timing of the ransom communications against the known timeline of Nancy's disappearance. The first note arrived roughly 3 days after she was reported missing. That delay became significant. In a traditional ransom scenario, early communication is critical, and it establishes control and reassures the victim's family that the person is alive. Delays introduce risk. risk that the victim's condition deteriorates, and risk that law enforcement gains ground. So why wait? One possible explanation is logistical: preparation, planning, or access to resources. But another possibility is more strategic. The delay allowed time for the initial investigation to develop, for media interest to build, and for the eventual message to have maximum impact. If that was the intent, it suggests an awareness of how information moves through public channels. And that awareness is not random. Investigators also examined the structure of the notes themselves. The language was controlled. The grammar was consistent. The formatting was deliberate. There were no obvious signs of panic or improvisation. From a forensic linguistics perspective, this matters. Linguistic analysis looks at how individuals use language, their vocabulary, sentence structure, punctuation habits, and even subtle patterns like spacing or capitalization. These elements can sometimes be compared across different communications to determine whether they originate from the same author. They can also reveal something else: effort. Because writing in a structured, composed manner, especially under the pressure of committing a serious crime, requires a certain level of cognitive control. It suggests the author either prepared the message in advance or was able to maintain composure after the fact. Neither scenario aligns easily with a chaotic, unplanned event. And yet the physical evidence at the scene suggested exactly that: something sudden, like something that escalated quickly. That contradiction deepened. Another layer of analysis focused on timing behavior. When messages are sent can be just as important as what they say. Investigators look for patterns, specific hours, intervals between communications, and correlations with external events like news coverage. If, for example, a message is sent shortly after a major broadcast about the case, it may indicate that the sender is actively monitoring media response. And in Nancy's case, that possibility could not be ignored, because the decision to contact media directly already suggested an awareness of its influence. If the sender was also tracking coverage in real time, it would reinforce the idea that the communication strategy was not static. It was responsive. That kind of responsiveness implies continued engagement, which raises another question. If the sender was watching the case unfold, why was there no adjustment when deadlines passed without payment? In most ransom cases, unmet demands trigger escalation. The offender may lower the amount, extend the deadline, or increase pressure through additional threats or proof-of-life material. Here, none of that happened. The messages remained controlled, but they did not evolve. This lack of adaptation became a focal point, because in behavioral analysis, rigidity can be just as telling as flexibility. A rigid pattern may suggest that the communication was not driven by negotiation, but by a predefined script. Something designed to be delivered in stages regardless of response. And if that's the case, it shifts the interpretation again, from interaction to presentation. But investigators also considered the possibility of staging within digital communication. Just as physical scenes can be altered to mislead, digital narratives can be constructed to create a specific impression. The use of Bitcoin, for example, carries a certain connotation: technical sophistication, anonymity, modern criminal methods. But invoking it is not the same as using it effectively. Without an active transaction, the demand remains theoretical. Which brings the focus back to intent. Was the goal to obtain money, or to introduce an element that made the crime appear more complex, more distant, more difficult to trace? At the same time, analysts revisited the earlier detail, the inclusion of non-public information about Nancy's home. That detail still stood out, because combining insider knowledge with external communication methods creates a hybrid profile. Someone who understands the environment of the victim, but also attempts to project distance from it. And that tension is difficult to maintain consistently. As digital forensics continued, each data point, no matter how small, was evaluated not in isolation but as part of a larger behavioral pattern. A pattern that now included delayed initial contact, media-focused communication, structured, composed language, lack of negotiation progression, selective use of non-public details, no confirmed financial transaction, Individually, each element could be explained. Together, they formed something more complex. Not a clear answer, but a narrowing field of possibilities. Looking at the communication itself, do you think the person behind the messages was trying to get paid? Or trying to control how the story was told? I'm curious how you interpret those choices. And while you're here, what time is it where you're watching from right now? Long before investigators attempt to identify who committed a crime, they ask a different question. Why this person? It's a principle known as victimology, the systematic study of a victim's life, routines, relationships, and risk factors. Not to assign blame, but to understand context, because crimes rarely occur in isolation. They intersect with patterns, daily habits, social connections, environmental exposure. And in many cases, those patterns help narrow the field of possibilities. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. By every available account, her life followed a structure that had become increasingly consistent over the years. She lived alone in her Tucson home, maintained a small but stable social circle, and adhered to routines shaped in part by her health. Routine in victimology can function in two ways. It can reduce risk by creating predictability and limiting exposure, or it can increase vulnerability by making behavior easier to anticipate. Nancy's days were not unpredictable. Neighbors described familiar rhythms, lights on and off at expected times, regular outings that followed similar routes, visits that were infrequent but consistent. Nothing in those patterns suggested volatility or sudden change. From an investigative standpoint, that kind of stability becomes a baseline, because when something disrupts it, the disruption stands out. On the evening of her disappearance followed that baseline closely, at least at first. She returned home after dinner, her garage door closing at 9:50 p.m. There were no indications of distress, no signs of deviation. Then, hours later, the pattern broke. And it broke abruptly. Victimology also examines dependency factors, medical needs, physical limitations, and reliance on external support. Nancy's heart condition placed her in a category that investigators classify as medically vulnerable. She depended on daily medication, and her pacemaker provided not only therapeutic support, but also a data stream that recorded her physiological status. This matters for two reasons. First, it narrows the window of survivability in the absence of care. Second, it raises the question of awareness. Would someone targeting Nancy know about her condition? If the answer is yes, it suggests familiarity, either through direct knowledge or observation. If the answer is no, it introduces a different kind of risk, that the offender acted without understanding the medical consequences of their actions. And that distinction can influence how investigators interpret intent. Nancy's home environment added another layer. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were found locked. Her belongings remained undisturbed. Nothing indicated that someone had searched the home extensively or attempted to remove items of value. From a victimology perspective, this reduces the likelihood of a traditional burglary scenario. In cases where theft is the primary motive, offenders typically interact with the interior space, opening drawers, moving objects, leaving behind signs of intrusion. That didn't happen here. Instead, the focal point remained near the entrance, which suggests something more immediate, an encounter rather than an intrusion. Victimology also considers social exposure. Who had access to Nancy's life? This includes family members, neighbors, service providers, acquaintances, anyone who may have had legitimate reasons to approach her home or interact with her directly. It also includes individuals who may have observed her routines without direct contact, because access does not always require a relationship. Sometimes it requires proximity. Investigators began mapping these connections, not as conclusions, but as possibilities. Each interaction, each point of contact, was evaluated for opportunity and context. At the same time, analysts revisited the detail introduced by the Ransom notes. The use of non-public information about Nancy's home. When victimology and communication intersect like this, it becomes significant. Because knowledge of a victim's environment often originates from one of three sources: direct experience inside the home, information shared by someone with access or observation over time. Each possibility carries different implications. Direct experience suggests prior entry, legitimate or otherwise. Shared information introduces the potential for indirect knowledge transfer. Observation implies sustained attention, watching patterns, learning routines, building familiarity from the outside. None of these explanations can be confirmed in isolation, but they begin to frame the question differently. Not just who could have committed the crime, but who could have known enough to construct the narrative that followed. Another aspect of victimology is target selection. Why Nancy? Her age placed her in a category often associated with increased vulnerability. Offenders, in some cases, select targets based on perceived ease. Individuals less likely to resist, more likely to be alone, less able to seek immediate help. But target selection can also be specific. It can be based on familiarity, personal connection, or knowledge that goes beyond general vulnerability. The presence of blood near the entrance suggests resistance, or at least a moment of conflict. That detail complicates assumptions about ease. It indicates that whatever occurred was not entirely passive. And that matters, because it speaks to the interaction between victim and offender. Victimology doesn't just ask who the victim was, it asks how the victim may have responded. And in Nancy's case, the evidence suggests that something happened quickly, something that did not unfold according to a controlled plan. As investigators continued to build her profile, one conclusion became increasingly clear. Nancy's life did not contain obvious indicators of high-risk exposure. There were no known threats, no recent conflicts brought forward publicly, no patterns that immediately suggested she was being targeted, which brings the focus back to proximity and knowledge. Because when a victim's life appears stable, the explanation for disruption often lies closer than expected. Not always, but often enough that investigators cannot ignore it. By the time investigators reached the stage, the case had split into competing directions. The physical evidence pointed one way, the ransom narrative pointed another, and the digital behavior added a third layer that didn't fully align with either. In unsolved cases, this is often where structured theory analysis becomes essential. Not speculation for its own sake, but a method of organizing possibilities based on available evidence, identifying what fits, what doesn't, and what remains unresolved. In Nancy Guthrie's case, three primary theories began to emerge. Each one attempts to explain the same set of facts. Each one carries its own strengths and its own limitations. Theory 1. A kidnapping that failed. Almost immediately, this theory starts with the most visible narrative, that Nancy was targeted for abduction, but something went wrong. Supporting elements. The ransom notes themselves establish intent, at least on the surface, to demand money. The use of Bitcoin suggests awareness of modern ransom methods. The early morning timeline aligns with a period when victims are more vulnerable and less likely to receive immediate help. Under this interpretation, the offender may have planned a controlled removal but encountered resistance at the door. The presence of blood near the entrance supports the idea of a struggle. If that struggle escalated, it's possible that Nancy was incapacitated, or worse, before the plan could be completed as intended. From there, the theory suggests a shift. Instead of abandoning the plan entirely, the offender continued with the ransom narrative as a way to recover control, to create the impression that Nancy was still alive, and that the situation remained negotiable. Contradicting elements. There is no verified proof of life at any stage. No direct communication with the family was established. The ransom demands did not evolve when deadlines passed. In most documented kidnapping cases, even failed ones, offenders attempt to maintain leverage. They adapt, adjust, and respond to pressure. Here, the communication remained static. Additionally, Nancy's medical condition introduces a critical inconsistency. A person planning a ransom would likely account for the victim's survival, especially if that survival directly affects their ability to collect payment. The absence of any reference to her health complicates this theory. Why it still matters? Because it aligns with the initial framing of the case and cannot be fully dismissed. The existence of ransom notes, regardless of their authenticity, requires investigators to consider the possibility that an abduction was at least attempted. Theory 2. A violent encounter followed by staging. This theory shifts the focus to the physical evidence and treats the ransom narrative as secondary. Under this interpretation, whatever happened at Nancy's front door was not a kidnapping attempt, but a confrontation that escalated quickly. The blood at the entrance, combined with the abrupt loss of pacemaker data, suggests a critical event within a narrow time frame. The ransom notes in this scenario are not the cause of the crime. They are the response to it, supporting elements. The scene does not reflect a controlled removal. There are no signs of extended activity inside the home. The timeline, from doorbell disconnection to pacemaker shutdown, indicates rapid progression. From a crime scene staging perspective, offenders sometimes attempt to alter the perceived nature of an event after it occurs. This can involve introducing elements that suggest a different motive, such as theft, disappearance, or in this case, kidnapping. The goal is not perfection, it's redirection. By creating a ransom narrative, the offender could shift investigative focus outward toward unknown external actors, rather than inward toward individuals with proximity or familiarity. Contradicting elements. The level of detail in the ransom notes suggests planning, not improvisation. The use of non-public information about the home indicates prior knowledge which could exist in either scenario. The sustained effort to send multiple communications implies continued engagement, not a single reactive decision. One of the challenges with this theory is reconciling the sophistication of the notes with the possibility of a spontaneous event. Staging can occur quickly, but maintaining a consistent narrative over time requires ongoing effort. Why it still matters? Because it aligns closely with the physical evidence. It explains the lack of negotiation, the absence of proof of life, and the inconsistencies in the ransom strategy. It also introduces a critical shift in perspective, from a crime driven by financial motive to one followed by narrative construction. On Theory 3, a known individual with constructed distance. The third theory focuses less on the type of crime and more on the profile of the person involved. It suggests that the individual responsible may have had some level of familiarity with Nancy, her home, her routines, or her environment, and attempted to create distance through the ransom narrative. Supporting elements. The inclusion of non-public details about the home. The absence of forced entry suggesting either access or approach without immediate alarm. The ability to construct controlled, structured communications after the event. This theory does not require a specific relationship. It could involve someone within her social orbit, or someone who observed her over time. What matters is access to information. From a behavioral profiling standpoint, offenders who attempt to distance themselves from a crime often introduce elements that point elsewhere. In this case, the use of media, cryptocurrency, and anonymous messaging could serve that purpose. It creates complexity, and complexity can delay clarity. Contradicting elements. There is no publicly confirmed evidence identifying a specific individual. Familiarity alone does not establish involvement. It only expands the pool of possibilities. The theory relies on interpretation of behavior, which must be supported by additional evidence. Why it still matters? Because it bridges the gap between the other two theories. It explains how someone could possess inside knowledge while also constructing an external narrative. Like, it accounts for both the physical evidence and the communication strategy, without requiring them to originate from separate sources. Where the theories leave the case. None of these explanations fully resolves every detail. Each one answers certain questions while raising others. And that is often the reality in ongoing investigations. The goal is not to choose a theory prematurely. It's to test them against evidence, against time, and against any new information that emerges. Because in cases like this, understanding what doesn't fit can be just as important as understanding what does. More than a month after Nancy Guthrie vanished, the structure of the investigation had changed, but its central question had not. What happened at that front door between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m.? By this stage, law enforcement agencies, including federal partners, had moved beyond the initial urgency of search and rescue operations and into a more complex phase. Evidence consolidation, behavioral analysis, and long-term case development. The search efforts had been extensive. Ground teams canvassed large areas surrounding Nancy's neighborhood. Desert terrain, difficult, expansive, and often unforgiving, was systematically covered in sections. Aerial units were deployed, cadaver dogs were brought in, investigators followed leads generated through tips, digital analysis, and geographic probability modeling. As of the most recent verified updates available at the time of this narrative, no confirmed recovery of Nancy Guthrie has been publicly announced. No arrest has been officially made. No suspect has been formally identified in court proceedings. While these are the confirmed facts, at the same time, law enforcement has not classified the case as closed. It remains active, and that distinction matters. Because an active case means evidence is still being processed, leads are still being evaluated, and information, however small, can still influence direction. Official position versus investigative direction. Public statements from authorities have remained measured. They have acknowledged the ransom communications. They have confirmed the presence of evidence at the home, indicating a violent event. They have continued to request information from the public, but they have not publicly endorsed a single definitive theory. This is not unusual. In ongoing investigations, especially those involving conflicting narratives, law enforcement often avoids committing to a public conclusion until evidence meets prosecutorial standards. The burden of proof in criminal cases beyond a reasonable doubt requires more than probability. It requires consistency, corroboration, and admissibility, which means some information remains internal, not hidden but withheld until it can be used effectively in court. Cold case versus active investigation. Understanding the difference. At this point, some viewers might wonder whether the case risks becoming a cold case. It hasn't, at least not by formal definition. A cold case typically refers to an investigation that has exhausted all immediate leads, with no active progress and no new evidence being processed. Nancy's case does not meet that threshold. Instead, it exists in a category sometimes referred to as active but unresolved. This stage involves re-examining existing evidence with updated forensic methods, running DNA samples, if available, through expanding databases, analyzing digital data with evolving technology, reassessing timelines and witness statements, monitoring for new tips or connections. Modern investigations are not static. Advances in DNA technology, forensic software, and data integration systems can reopen avenues that were previously unavailable. For example, genetic genealogy, used in several high-profile cases in recent years, has allowed investigators to identify individuals through distant familial DNA matches. While there is no public confirmation that such methods are being used here, they represent one of the tools available in contemporary investigations. The role of public information authorities have continued to emphasize the importance of public cooperation. In cases involving limited direct evidence, external observations can become critical. A seemingly minor detail, an unfamiliar vehicle, an unusual interaction, a pattern that didn't stand out at the time, can gain significance when placed alongside other data. If tip lines or contact channels are made available by law enforcement, they are typically included in official statements or department releases. As of now, viewers are encouraged to refer to verified law enforcement sources for the most current contact information related to this case. Providing information through official channels ensures that it is documented, evaluated, and integrated into the investigative process appropriately. What has changed and what hasn't? Since the early days of the investigation, several things have become clearer. The event at Nancy's home was not consistent with a clean, controlled abduction. The Ransom narrative has not produced measurable results, financial or otherwise. The timeline of the incident remains tightly confined to a narrow window of activity, but key questions remain unresolved. Where is Nancy Guthrie? What exactly occurred during those 41 minutes? Who had the knowledge required to construct the narrative that followed? These are not small gaps. They are the core of the case. The importance of time in unsolved investigations. Time affects cases in different ways. It can degrade physical evidence. It can weaken memory recall, but it can also introduce new opportunities. Witnesses may come forward later. Technology may reveal what was previously hidden. Connections that once seemed unrelated may begin to align. Investigators often revisit cases with fresh perspective, sometimes years later, when new information reframes old evidence. That process is not visible day to day, but it is constant. A case without closure. For now. At this point, there is no confirmed resolution, no verified outcome that answers the central question. And in cases like this, the absence of closure is not just an investigative reality. It is a human one. Because behind every timeline, every data point, every theory, there is a person whose story has not been fully accounted for. Nancy Guthrie's last known moments are defined by interruption, a routine evening, a sudden break in pattern, a sequence of events that escalated in less than an hour. Yet everything that followed, searches, statements, theories, exists in response to that gap. And until that gap is filled with verified answers, the case remains open. Not just officially, but in every sense that matters. If you've followed this case all the way through, what do you believe is the most important, unanswered question right now? I'd really like to hear your perspective. And before you go, where are you watching from? And what's one detail in this case you haven't been able to stop thinking about? In the end, this case doesn't just leave behind unanswered questions. It leaves behind competing versions of reality. One version was presented to the public, structured, deliberate, and repeated through carefully written ransom messages. A story of control, a story of negotiation, a story that suggested time was still in play. And the other version exists in fragments of evidence. A disconnected doorbell camera, a brief window of movement in the early hours of the morning, a sudden loss of biometric data, blood at the threshold of a home that showed no signs of forced entry. These two versions were never fully aligned, and that misalignment is where the case continues to live. In many investigations, the challenge is uncovering what happened. Here, the challenge is also understanding why it was made to look like something else. Because constructing a narrative, especially one detailed enough to involve national media, requires intention. It requires time, composure, and a clear sense of what the audience is meant to believe. That introduces a different kind of question. Not just what occurred, but what someone wanted others to think occurred. This is where behavioral psychology becomes part of the analysis. When individuals attempt to influence perception after an event, their choices often reflect priorities. What they include, what they omit, and how they structure information can reveal as much as the physical evidence itself. In Nancy's case, certain elements were emphasized. A specific monetary demand, the use of cryptocurrency, references to her home environment. But other elements were absent. No direct communication with the family, no proof that she was alive. No adaptation when deadlines pass. That imbalance is difficult to ignore. Because if the objective was negotiation, the strategy lacked responsiveness. But if the objective was narrative, the structure was consistent. Another layer of reflection comes from legal standards and evidentiary limits. In public discussion, it's easy to move from possibility to assumption. But in a courtroom, that transition requires proof, evidence that can be tested, challenged, and verified beyond reasonable doubt. And in this case, that threshold has not yet been met. No individual has been formally charged. No theory has been legally established as fact. Which means every interpretation remains exactly that, an interpretation. Grounded in evidence, informed by analysis, but not resolved. There's also the question of time. Not just how long the investigation has been active, but how time shapes understanding. In the first days, the focus was urgency. Finding Nancy, following leads, responding to the Ransom narrative. As days turned into weeks, the emphasis shifted toward analysis, examining inconsistencies, testing theories, reevaluating assumptions. Right now, the case exists in a different phase, one where progress may not be visible, where developments may happen quietly, where answers, if they come, may arrive long after the initial attention has faded. This is not uncommon in unresolved cases, but it changes how they are experienced by investigators, by communities, and by those following from a distance. And then there is Nancy herself, not just as a name in a case file, but as a person whose life followed a rhythm that was interrupted without explanation. An evening that began normally, a home that reflected routine and familiarity, a moment at the front door that shifted everything. Victimology reminds us that understanding a case begins with understanding the person at its center, not just what happened to them, but the life that existed before that moment. And in Nancy's case, that life does not point clearly toward risk, which makes the disruption more difficult to explain and more important to understand. As this story stands now, there is no single conclusion that accounts for every detail. There are theories, there are patterns, there are gaps, and those gaps are where the investigation continues. Because sometimes the most important part of a case is not the answer that is known, but the question that remains. After everything you've heard, what do you think matters more in this case? The physical evidence at the scene or the story someone tried to build afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been following closely, tell me, what detail still doesn't sit right with you? Please don't forget to subscribe for more cases like this.